just to give you a brief overview of the day, a background to the event itself more kind of centrally. To give you, and I quote, a brief but substantive introduction to commoning with reference to Ireland, so brace yourselves for that, and then a little comment on what a thinkery might be, and I'm roasted along that night. So, okay, so first of all, the day. The first thing about the day is that the idea of it is simply that we gather and talk, but that we put enough ideas into the room that we can speak across our various differences in a common way. And we are very delighted to have our guests. Andy Ryan, where's Anne hiding? Where's Anne? At the back, over there. We have Sylvia Federici and George Carfensis, who have come all the way from New York to be with us today. And each of these speakers bring great expertise and experience and diversity to the room today, and we are so happy that you're with us. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to give a brief but substantive introduction coming with reference to Ireland first, and then we'll have an interview with Órla for the morning, and we're going to have an open day where there's a lot of interaction and questions back and forth and discussion. We have put in a big lunch time, and that isn't so that everybody runs off into town to buy things or anything like that. It's in a commoners environment that won't happen, but that we stay together and maybe chat over the day. And then in the afternoon, Anne will speak to us, and Eilish will also guide us through the day. So it's actually fairly loose, and it's not hugely tied up in a kind of a regimented fashion, we hope. So, and of course, I've forgotten to introduce the rest of the team. So we have Órla O'Donovan, and Eilish Dillon here is also a part of the team who organised it. So I might start with just a brief background to the project as a whole. 2 years ago, Órla O'Donovan, who is the main driver of the entire enterprise, and myself and Tom O'Connell from Metro State University in Minnesota got together to pull together a journal, a special issue of the Community Development Journal on Commons. And so we put out a call for articles from all around the place to see what might come in. The journal was really aimed at community development workers and to introduce commoning into that context specifically, and to see what connections or disconnections there might be between commoning and community development, both local and global. And that was quite a venture. That was a fantastic exercise. Out of that, we decided we'd organise a Thinkery, an unusual word, and last year we held a Thinkery. And at that point, Eilish Dillon from the School of Development Studies in Kimmage came on board with her great vigour and pragmatism and humour, and we organised the day in Kimmage Manor, and some of you indeed were probably at that day. We had our guest Gustavo Esteva again, who brought great wisdom and insight to the day, and we have that on record for history. So it was a wonderful day. So we decided we'd have another run at it and see if we could expand ourselves. And really, I think the idea is to put ideas, to generate a shared vocabulary, and to put a high degree of communal reflection on the many projects that we're all involved in. I think, Órla and myself certainly, it started off in almost total ignorance about this, and remain largely ignorant about it in many respects. So there's no claim to expert anything here. This is what we're talking about, this is what we're thinking about, we think it's important. Please talk back to us and with us. So now I'm going to just move on to the brief but substantive introduction to commoning with reference to Ireland. And the first thing I'd say is that when all of those articles came into us, the first thing, when you read over all the variety of types of commons projects that are out there, everything from urban gardens to radical revolutionary movements, many of them organised around natural resources, but also urban-based political movements, digital and cultural commons. They cover all sorts of domains. You could take a quick, as a sort of analytic look over it, and you could say, okay, this is a new social movement. And if you look writ large, you can see that at some level it runs across a traditional, revolutionary, through reform, into assimilationist kind of spectrum. You'll get everything in there. And so we just tick that box and put commons into a box and put it away. I'm afraid that's not possible in any respect. That is only the most superficial assessment of what is actually happening globally. And so we possibly, I certainly stepped through with a relative amount of innocence and a little hippie feeling. And so really as we engaged, as we read more and more, we realised that this is really an unbelievably layered and complex reality. It really, really is. And when we dug a little bit deeper, we began to realise that this is just not about managing things. It really is not. It is not about managing things. It's not just about land or food or knowledge or cultural world or digital world at all. Nor is it even about abstract beliefs or philosophies, though they are important, or political positions. Ultimately, it seemed to us, when we talked about it, that it is about relationships. It's about how we relate to the world, the natural and social world, and even indeed how we relate to ourselves individually, personally. Anna and myself were talking about this morning at breakfast. You know, even in internal morality, how you respect yourself, never mind anybody else in this. And that Commons has something to bring to bear on all of this. So in those articles, the other thing that we could see was a kind of anarchic pragmatism, that all over the place people took what was to hand in every respect. They took the resources, the history, the beliefs, the community that was to hand, and put them to work for the common good in a commoning fashion, even if it was slightly incoherent and didn't fit all those nice little boxes. So they just picked up what they had, resisted consumerism, resisted commodification, resisted hyper-individualism, resisted privatisation, and said, actually no, there's a better way of doing things. And we have all these different projects all around doing so. So on the one hand, it seems that Commons is never simply about a specific domain or philosophy or politics, nor even about groups in isolation. However, we can say definite things about it. It would seem that the success or failure of commoning can depend upon its scale. So for somebody like me who is, belongs to the old utopian hippie tradition where we are actually going to take over the whole world and make it all a beautiful place and it's all going to be grand, it would seem that maybe that very desire is itself imperial. So you have to catch yourself. So that scale is very important, and scale again, once again, goes to relationship. There are only so many people you can relate to at a time in any meaningful way. So I want to know how many people have 10,000 friends on Facebook, for example. That's just an immediate example. How can we relate and at what scale? Duration is an issue. Social mix, location, geography, history, and cultural and political environment. And of course, inevitably Commons in almost every instance comes up against the state and the market. But again, it does so either in outright resistance and refusal, or will negotiate with it and make demands of it, insisting that it provides an infrastructure to enable communities to take care of their own well-being in an autonomous and responsible and self-governing fashion. So even with all this multifaceted nature, even if there's diametrically opposed practices that we might see in this large reality, on the one hand you might have life-changing agrarian or communitarian ways of commoning, or on the other you might have much more bounded managerial, pragmatically based governance systems. All of these try to resist the commodification of the world, natural or cultural. All try to circumvent the alienation of individuals from each other and their communities. All resist the destruction, the exploitation and control of resources by a few at the expense of the many, or the many for the few. They resist infantile politics. All want autonomy and freedom and a self-sustaining world. So one might argue that the devil is in the detail here, and that it is precisely the strategies, the philosophies and the politics that we should be debating heavily. And of course I'm a bit of an explanation anorak, and I love all that sort of thing, and I love theory and logic and argument, but at this stage I'm actually not so sure about that. I'm actually really not so sure about that. However, in all of this, am I suggesting that commons is everything and therefore nothing? That mere intent is enough to make a commons? Absolutely not. On the contrary, it is identifiable and bounded with very material consequences and with an ongoing and contested set of criteria for enactment and success. So if I were to say what is commons, I'd say, well, it's really a little like the difference between erotica and pornography. and while it might be a bit early in the morning for such an analogy, I think later on you'll see that it's not. On the contrary, you know it when you see it. You know it when you see it. So I know that George will address this matter very directly when he talks about the assimilation of commons by neo-Hardians, people who retain a deeply pessimistic view of human ways, perhaps cynically, so that in fact common pool resources, language and methods become subsumed into outright capitalist regimes, an imperial move where commons itself becomes the new frontier for neoliberalism. So what am I saying? That there really is no innocence here for us or anyone else. And at this stage, I think it's very important that we might suggest that commons must constantly look out and look inwards. At its best, it does this. We look at our internal dynamics to sustain ourselves. So it is also not simply about our relations to, as we suggest, the state of the market or our immediate environment, but it is also about personal and public psychologies and moralities. So, again and again, I have come to meetings over the years, and I don't know if anybody else has noticed this. There's always loads of historians and sociologists and engineers and farmers and activists and everybody else. And often I've gotten into the habit of saying, are there any psychologists in the room? Is there any psychologists in the room? Bingo. So, we'll just leave that floating up in the air. No psychologists, because the language of morality, the language of personal autonomy, all that language has to some extent been enclosed by therapy, medicalised, by theology, and various discourses that we find ourselves embarrassed to talk about it in some way. And I actually think it's something we might need to bring into the commons. How to do it? Somebody help do it. You know, I have no idea. So, I suppose to kind of just close up on this little bit of a section, how many of us have lived in a radical hope of radical social change, revolutionary change, only to watch such attempts replicate the very problems they sought to overcome? I think we've all lived with this at some level or another, and we need to know why. We need to know why, and maybe today we could talk a little bit about that, so that we can bring the problems of our own projects forward and talk about them and unlock them a bit. So before I finish this section on commoning, with reference to Ireland, there is one other aspect of the commons that I would like to just briefly reference, if only to gesture at it. And it has to do with dominant founding stories of the commons. So it's a routine of commons historiography to explain it with reference to its opposite enclosure, Garrett Harding notwithstanding. Historians tell us that flourishing communal ownership and management of land was dealt a fatal blow in 17th century English with mass land enclosures, literally fencing the land for private purposes, leaving people landless, with nothing left to sell but their labour. But anybody who knows history knows that, of course, every history has an erasure hidden behind it. So if we rely on this story alone of enclosure, we allow that very story to structure how we think and respond to both the processes of commodification and of commoning. In a queer way, it keeps looking at them. So it is too narrow, that story, and itself a kind of trick of enclosure. And there are other tales to add to this. So I know that our guest, Sylvia, in her book Caliban and the Witch, has written comprehensively on the control of women's bodies as a paradigm of enclosure. She notes the rise of patriarchal systems which monopolise both the productive and reproductive capacities of women as predating and in fact modelling the later 17th century land enclosures. I agree. I have no doubt that there are other histories, animals and children and all sorts of things come into mind. This isn't about simply a single story again, but that's what we always keep open. But just today, finally, I want to take a real example of this paradigm from our own context, if I may, and this is the Irish bit. As we know, last Friday on May 22nd, we had a referendum on the extension of civil marriage rights to all adults without regard to their sex, known as the same-sex marriage referendum. It passed in a landslide victory, supported by most of the major political and social institutions of the country, with notable exceptions. So without tiptoeing around this, I was part of the Yes Equality campaign and coordinated the national bus tour. We covered 11,000 kilometres in 29 days in support of local Yes Equalities in all 26 counties. It was quite a ride, and this ran right up to last Friday. So you will excuse me, please. I'm tired and emotional after this amazing event. If I can only truthfully reflect on the Commons in this context today in a very raw way. So, what's the premise here? Sexuality is a commons, and we have yet to learn what that might mean, notwithstanding our both Puritan and hippie disasters. I'll not rehearse all the ancillary resistance points which were raised in the public domain against a yes vote, but their resonance is important. The stubborn Gordian knot of this patriarchal paradigm is illustrated precisely in the difficulty that all voters had in trying to disentangle the right of LGBT people to access civil marriage from their traditional understanding of marriage. And I mean all voters. Such ideas about the nature, structure and function of marriage reveal just how much of an enclosure it really was. And I say was. It raised up the matter of the role and function of women as mothers, not wives, lovers, partners, friends, of men as fathers, with repeating and distressing self-hating insinuations of sexual depravity and the predation of children. All voters. With reductive ideas as to the nature of complementarity, attraction and desire, child-rearing, surrogacy, sex education, and a generalised anxiety about the future foundations of society and its stability. And as we know, we got a missive from the Vatican saying that Ireland has defeated humanity. That's a very strong response to the referendum, one with which I disagree. In succeeding, the referendum allows two people of the same sex to marry, and in doing so radically separates the erotic, love and desire from the logic of production and reproduction, challenging both orthodox religious and classic Darwinian-style scientific understandings of the purpose of human life and the foundations of society. In turn, this crucially places the relationship of two adults as equals at the cornerstone of society. In other words, the relationship between peers moves into a more central location. And it's funny because throughout the referendum, it was like as if no one could see, you just turn to your partner. It kept going down the line. It was never just turn to your partner. It was never this peer discussion. Marriage is no longer, only formally I might add, an instant pyramid with a man at the top and everyone else getting younger, shorter and fairer down the line. The shape of marriage has changed from a pyramid to a circle, we hope, or perhaps to a line. So paradoxically, in letting outsiders into one of the most enclosed spaces on the planet, we took up the fences and opened it out. There's more room for everyone, even if the couple is still held in place. So why do I raise the referendum in the context of the Commons today? Because more specifically, during the National Bus Tour, one of the most common responses in every town by both yes and no voters to our young lesbian bus team members was the following. I'm going to vote X or Y. I've nothing against you, pet, love, sweetheart, but sure, you're gorgeous. You're just such a waste. You're such a waste. Across the country, this is what came up again and again, to the distress of the young women, you can imagine. This single devastating element, among many others, seems to me to expose a rationale that perhaps we all carry in us, and that exposes the spirit of enclosure, my own included. Waste is bad, production is good. So I believe that there is an enormous problematic paradox here at the heart of the Commons and life in general, which we've only really begun to explore. The idea that women's bodies are a type of land which must be accessible, controllable, managed and productive is both a reality and a paradigm which challenges both commoners and enclosers alike. Romantic notions of nature held by many commoners feed into this paradigm. I have heard Anne speak most eloquently about the idea that enough is plenty and we need to think about this and other things in our Thinkery. So this ongoing conversation on the Commons is robust indeed, and in Ireland we have a whole new domain to talk about and lots of wonderful things to argue about and grow and develop. Our guest last year, Gustavo Esteva, set out very clear boundaries in what in his considered opinion is and is not a Commons or Commons practice. He chauffeured us through the day with great grace and provocation and humour and warmth. And our guests today Sylvia and George and Anne will also set out their expertise, their experience and their passion on this matter to signpost us through a journey on thinking about the commons. I know, for example, Sylvia has a very, very sturdy set of criteria indeed, in which she delineates functioning commons from pseudo-commons, and I look forward to engaging with this in clarity and strength today. We're going to have quite a good day. I think it's fantastic. So that's my bit, brief but substantive bit in commons in relation to the Ireland. Now, just a few words on what a Thinkery is, and then I'll sit down and I'm off duty for the day. So, finally, just a few words on what's a Thinkery. It's a less than sonorous term, but the idea of it really is, it draws on Ivan Illich's notion of convivial conversation, a form of mutually tempered forbearance in conversation, as he would put it. It is again about conversation between peers. Essentially, it's about listening rather than engaging in parallel monologues. I think of it as a kind of a hothouse, sort of a hothousing, where you can sit down and really take your time to generate hybrid ideas, consciously relaxing, consciously generating flexible ways in and out of the problems that we all have, personal and political and social and all the rest of it, and of celebrating the really radical hope that things can be different, and we know they can. Things can change. Yay! We do not treat each other or the world as a thing. We relate to it, be interested, it's alive, and we engage it in that way. So I suppose really what I'm saying finally is this. We're not here simply to repeatedly describe our own projects, to repeatedly rehash the old politics that we endure and wallpaper the wall with a kind of an inevitability. The idea is really to try and listen and talk about the problems and be reflective. In the end, we don't have to overcome anything. We don't have to prove anything. We don't have to win anything. We can just relax here today. We don't have to do anything at all at some level. So I'm getting a bit lyrical here, so I have to stop. On the other hand, clarity and sensibility are not at odds. So thank you for forbearance on this extended introduction, and welcome. And now I'm going to hand you over to Sylvia and George and Órla, who will give us their expertise, experience and passion.